What's going on, guys? This is your host, Nabil Hussein, founder of the Guyana page, Journey Through the Generations, bringing to you this presentation, the process of tracing your Indo-Guyanese genealogy. So before we get started, we'll go over a few things, first of which is a brief overview on Indian indentureship in Guyana. The first two ships that came were the Whitby with 249 and the Hesperus with 165 that arrived on the 5th of May 1838. About 85% were Hindu, while about 15% were Muslims. Indentureship is said to have ended in 1917. 245 ships made 534 voyages from India to British Guiana. 2 ships arrived in 1838, 244 ships made 44 voyages between 1845 and 1848, and 209 ships made 488 voyages between 1851 and 1917. About 76% of Indians who came were from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. They mostly embarked from the port of Calcutta, now Kolkata. Almost 239,000 Indians were brought between 1838 and 1917. About 75,547 of which chose to return to India. The last set that returned left on September 4th, 1955. Today it is estimated that there are about 325,000 Indians, making up 43.5% of the population in Guyana. About 125,000 persons are mixed, many of them Douglas. Second point, the significant impact of Indian indentureship in Guyana. Indians ensured the survival of the sugar industry. They developed other economic activities and were largely responsible for the development of the rice industry. Indian village settlement is integrally associated with rice cultivation. From the 1880s, Indian immigrants displayed a high occupational profile in a number of off-plantation economic activities. Immigrants and their descendants have made and continue to make tremendous strides in the social, economic, cultural, education, political, and trade union fields. Contribution towards a rice heritage in our multicultural and pluralistic society, Indian customs, values, and traditions have survived. And then, as you can see, there are a few pictures here. The top left is a medical examination of the East Indian arrivals in British Guiana in the 1890s. An East Indian hut in British Guiana, 1910. The ranges or lodges in British Guiana in the 1890s. East Indian workers constructing a path through the British Guiana forest in 1900. A group of Indian coolies in British Guiana in 1924. And another picture here at mealtime in British Guiana, 1890. Then here is a few points from the video. Who is Minani? The process of tracing your genealogy in Indo-Caribbean communities. And this video can be seen on YouTube. Talisha Ramsarup and Ryan Prasadi from Lotus Toronto had done this video. Indentureship was not discussed much at home. We knew we came from India, but that was pretty much it, you know. For most of us, our first real exposure to indentureship was by reading the book Kuli Woman by Gayatri Bahadur. The indentured laborers were not English-speaking, so therefore the British recorded their names how they interpreted it from the Indians, which resulted in a lot of names being remixed or remade. And this is also true when it comes to villages, etc. Most people had call names. Rarely would people know someone's book name. A lot of our last names came about when they arrived in the Caribbean because most people, they didn't have a last name. It was just the first name. In a lot of cases, the last name is not even the actual last name. It could be the first name of your ancestor. In addition to finding information, most likely you have to do a lot of deciphering, and Google is your friend. So now we'll go over the topics that I plan to discuss today. Tips to remember when starting out, documenting your family history findings, building your family tree and gathering pictures, using social media, ancestry websites and DNA, understanding various British Guiana documents, recommended locations to visit and suggestions, online resources, suggestions for other Guyanese, for example, the Afro-Guyanese, the Portuguese, etc., on how to learn more about their ancestry, and suggestions to learn more about Guyana's history and indentureship. Tips to remember when starting out. Know which journey you would like to travel upon, either just searching for your ancestors' information, or you are searching for family in general. There's pros and cons to both, which I hope we will get into later on. Understand that it is not a 1, 2, 3 process, and that it is very time consuming. There'll be days when you literally feel like giving up because it can be so challenging emotionally, especially. I have a relative, for example, that's been working on the family tree for like 30 years or something. I mean, the only reason why I've probably been able to get, the only reason I've probably been able to get as far as I have thus far is through the help of others, and of course, because of social media and whatnot. So, keep that in mind. You'll meet different types of people. Some that are more than willing to help, some that have information but choose not to share it because of one of three reasons: selfishness, privacy, or because there's some secret they're afraid can get out by them giving you information. And there's also a very few amount of people that would like to help, but they just don't know much. So you'll meet those three types of people typically. You will learn a lot about how some people behave. Some that are very kind, some that are very ignorant. Some individuals' behavior can be very, very discouraging, but don't let this, get you down. You just try to keep moving forward. However, how far you go is based on how far you want to go. And basically, this means that you have to determine how far you want to go on your journey and at what point you want to stop. Just because there seems to be a roadblock at one area, don't be afraid to try another avenue in order to learn about what you need to know. Just like in life, leave room for disappointment, keep your expectations low. Know your limits. Try not to get involved with family gossip and secrets, because honestly, that's none of your business. So just focus on just gathering information for the family tree. Don't be selfish. Just as you would want someone to share what information that they have gathered with you, don't be selfish when a family member asks you to do the same for them. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. When asking for family information, remember that saying, because it basically means that you're more likely to get what you want by acting in a polite way or in a sweet way than in a distasteful way. So don't be rude about it. Be as kind as you possibly can, as you always should, anyways. And just try to stay connected to those who stay connected to you. Understand there will be family that either don't want to stay connected or they simply don't care. And that's okay, because as long as you made the effort, then that's what counts. Because as you progress, you'll be able to connect with hundreds of people, hopefully, like I have, and naturally it's hard to stay connected to all of them. So basically, what you try to do is you try to stay connected to those who try to stay connected to you. It's very simple. It's a two-way street. Building your own family tree, part one. Start with you, then your siblings, if you have siblings or if you're an only child, and then your parents, and then you simply keep moving more and more up. You talk to your parents, you ask them for their cousin, you start with your cousins, of course, your parents' siblings' children, if they have siblings, you know, um, and then you ask your parents about their cousins and et cetera, and you just keep progressing, right? You try to get right? You try to get the formal name, the book name, right? Because this is very crucial. As you progress, you'll figure out why I'm saying that, right? Nicknames, the clan name and the maiden names may also be useful. And, it's good to always try to record the name of the person, how they were born, like the name that they had at birth, because that may be useful later on. Most likely, women are more likely to know more about the family. Men used to do their own thing back home. For the most part, there were some of them that would know information, but that's very rare. Yeah, like I said, in most cases, in my case, I know that mostly men have met, the family because they go about, right? And women typically can provide things like birth dates, death dates, etc. Try to get in contact with as much of the older generation as possible. And typically they would prefer to speak over the phone, so when you speak with them, you can perhaps record the conversation because naturally you would not be able to remember everything they say. And sometimes you may not even understand what they said properly or didn't hear properly, because sometimes the audio may be low or something. So you can maybe even ask them to repeat themselves. You can maybe even keep a notebook next to you, and you don't have to record them, but I would prefer to just record them and just transcribe it later, because sometimes you may record it and you'll pick up something that you didn't pick up in the actual phone call, and that's happened to me multiple times, right? Try to gather information on where the people were born, where they lived, and where they passed. In my experience, I learned that the in-laws, primarily the females of the family, but in some cases the male as well, tend to give information that their spouse's family doesn't really talk about, such as, hidden children or, stories, etc. And of course, ask your grandparents if they're still around, ask them as much as possible, talk with them, sit down with them, and sit with them and talk with them. Try to learn as much as you can. And if possible, look at their birth certificates, and I'll explain a little bit more about why that is so important and why that could be very useful towards going further in your family research. I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. Building your own family tree part 2. In most cases, there's someone in your family that knows something. Most cases. You just have to find them. You just ask around, or is there anybody else who has worked on the family tree? In my case, I've come into contact with multiple people because I've talked to people and they said, "Oh, this body was trying to walk on the family tree too." So I could give you number, or I could give you she number, and you could talk to them, and you can try. Maybe you could get the information you're asking for, right? So it's very good to get in contact with the other family historians, if there are any, because there are. Every family is different. It's important to know how to read cursive, as most old documents is in cursive. There's videos, of course, on YouTube that can help you. When people see that you are genuinely passionate about finding out information about the family tree, then sometimes they may help you. But honestly, this is very rare. I've only come across I've come across very few individuals like this. One or two of them would actually even volunteer, like their family trees. Like I'm talking about the family historians. They've actually willingly sent me their family trees, but again, this is very rare. Most of the time, you don't encounter people like that. Be prepared for some family members who refuse to tell you anything, and because some memories can be too painful, traumatic, or even embarrassing for them to recall. So you have to understand that. Depending on the situation, you can depending on what it is, you can try to ask other people. But if it's just too thing, then you'll have to probably leave it alone. And it is what it is. Collecting old family photographs. Women are more likely to have old pictures, but in some cases, there are men that were photographers. For the most part, there were men that were photographers, and maybe in some cases there were women photographers as well. But I've come into contact with maybe one or two that were photographers in the family, and they were able to provide some photographs. So that's very good. Try to get in contact. Try to find those people in the family if there are any. sometimes there's always that one auntie that has a big collection of photographs. You always try to ask around about that particular person. Because in most families, there are that one person. You just have to find out who they are. And if they're not alive, then that gets a little challenging because you don't know. Then you have to ask, oh, which of their children would have these albums? And in some cases, the children are selfish with the pictures and they don't want to share it. So, it's a lot of challenges. The National Archives tried to set up a photograph repository, but failed simply due to people being either selfish or private with the pictures. Now, these are two people, Sana Dulway and myself. Sana does a really good photo colorization, and you can contact her to maybe colorize your photos. And of course, she's on Instagram, she has a website, she has email. Try to contact her. Me, I try to do a little bit of restoration, like the damages in the photo, and I try to enhance it as well. So you can try to contact me if you need help. I'm willing to help. So something that you have to keep in mind, right, is that especially for those who immigrated very early on out of Guyana, like in the 70s or the 80s, this was a very rough time for Indians. So they were more concerned about just coming out of Guyana than bringing their albums with them. Like there are some cases, a lot of cases actually, where people have told me that they left their albums in Guyana, and then when they went back to Guyana to visit years later, it wasn't there, it was destroyed, or so a lot of cases you might encounter that. It's very unfortunate, but again, it is what it is. Writing oral histories. It's very good to gather as much oral stories as you can, but don't take it as the complete truth. Then don't take it as gospel, for example, meaning take it only as a hint then, until you can perhaps confirm by documents. And what I mean by that is like information, like, oh, this person, like for example, this ancestor came to this plantation, right? Like I have one ancestor that one of my grandmother's cousins, he wrote down that he went to Wales. Now that may be true, that may not be true, but it's not recorded in the documents. On the immigration details that I received for that ancestor, it said that he went to Plantation Hope. So you have to try to find out. You have to just take it as a hint until you can confirm it. Conduct interviews, like I said, you could voice record it and then transcribe it later on. You try to build up, an ancestor. So you try to, if you find out, this ancestor in our family came to India, right? You try to find out as much as you possibly can. Or when did he come? How old was he? And if he came with anybody, what was his caste? What was his or her caste? If they returned, etc., etc. Try to find out things that would separate them, because as you learn, you'll realize that there's a lot of people that has the same name. And if you can find out details about their immediate children, the children of the immigrants, then you try to find out where they lived, their occupation, housing, etc., clothing, food, cultural continuation, religion, achievements, documentation, period, newspapers, magazines, gazettes, registers of births, deaths, marriages, documenting your family history findings. Try to keep the information handwritten and digitally, in multiple online locations if you can, and try to keep it updated with any new information found. And you can perhaps buy a journal or even use simple notebook paper as a hard copy of the information that you've collected, right? And why I say this is that in case something happens to one, you have the other. I would recommend either Microsoft PowerPoint, which requires a paid subscription, or Google Slides, which is 100% free, family trees, right? But the plus to using hard copy is that you can, of course, use it to write down stories. And of course, you can also use Google Documents or even Microsoft Word to write down your oral stories too. It's up to you, right? Ask for information in stages, right? Prioritize, meaning, ask what you really ask for the information that you need at the you need like ASAP, and then ask for other pieces of information later on, right? Try not to burden anyone, right? Because don't be annoying about it, because more than likely they'll become tired of you and eventually just stop giving you any information, period. And of course, you don't want that, so please bear that in mind. You try to confirm the information collected, right? Simply because sometimes somebody may tell you, right, a family story, and then someone else in the family, either a cousin or somebody else, may say, no, that's not true. This is the actual story. So you have to try to confirm the info collected. And this doesn't just apply to family stories. It applies to everything about family, everything that you're recording, right? Perhaps you could use symbols for those who came from India. Be creative, and for those who remain there, and whatever info you obtained from family memories, local registers, immigrant passes, etc. When collecting information of extended family members, remember that names are the most important in terms of your parents' cousins, right? But as you get further up, it's important that you try to get date of births, because this can be helpful, and you'll learn about that later on. But most of the time, right, people are more private with date of birth information when the individuals are still alive. But if they've passed on, then most likely this information will be given to you. And oh yeah, when gathering info, don't expect one individual to know everything. They may know a lot, but not everything. So don't burden just one person. Don't burden anybody, period, right? Just try to ask little bit by little bit by little bit. Again, a reminder, this entire process takes a lot of time. It's very much doable, but it takes time, right? I would suggest that you download the slides or the PowerPoint app, and which contains your digital family tree on your phone. And this will come in handy as time goes on, simply because, like for example, it can come in handy in times of a pinch. Like basically, like if you meet somebody and they say, "Oh, we're related," and I say, "Well, how though?" And then like, oh, they'll start calling names of people that they're related to, that you're apparently related to too as well. So then you can pull out your family tree on your phone and say, oh, you could even it's digital, so you can type in the name, and boom, 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 it'll come up, and you can figure it out. So it'll come in handy as you learn more, right, as time goes on. There are several numbering systems available. In this example, the Henry system is used. It can be quickly understood, and each family member gets his or her number, which can be used for generations to come, right? 1 for the first child of the arriving ancestor, 2 for second, 3 for third, etc. 1 for first child of first child, 2 for first of the second child, etc. A slight change that was made from the Trinidadian genealogist Shamsuddin to help it make it more understandable. You can read it in Arabic style from right to left. 1, 2, 3, for example, would be the third child of the second child of the first child of the arriving ancestor. A family tree for 1,200 relatives, for example, is difficult in a book to put in diagram format, right? So typically you can just use the diagram for like the first 3 generations, like the ancestor and their children, the grandchildren of the immigrants, and from then on you just write it down, in a vertical format, I guess, if that makes sense. And you can use the Henry number system as sort of like a table of contents. Use of font size, capitals, punctuation marks to separate generations, and kind of make it, a little bit more understandable. That to see themselves as kind of like a greater whole unit. So in this slide, I have multiple examples of how you can organize family tree data and various instances you may encounter when finding out information, right? For example, on the left, you have I have an example there, color coding it, the names for boys and girls, pink for girls, of course, and blue for boys. Another example is color coding per child, as you can see in the category below the parents' names. Color coding per child and their descendants. That's just one example. Something you have to keep in mind is that siblings were not all necessarily born in the same villages. Most cases, yes, but in some cases, no. In some cases, the eldest was actually the first to pass away. I myself encountered this at least 3 times when I was finding out information. In most cases, when a couple got married, the woman would move to where the husband and his family lived. So sometimes it may be easier to find out info on his side, but not the wife's side because she moved where her husband lived. So if the wife had a brother, right, for example, your grandmother, if she had a brother, you find out where the brother lived. Because in a lot of cases, the brother lived where their parents lived, your great-grandparents, for example, in some cases. That I've encountered most of the time, yes, but in some cases, the brother moved away as well. In a few cases, the couple were from the same village and they stayed right there. In one case, one of the brothers happened to marry a girl that had the same name as his sister. And in one instance, this actually caused a confusion. Because some people thought, because excuse me, one of my great-grandfathers, he had a sister named, the call name was Habib. Right, it was a girl, but the call name was Habib. Her name was Habiban, right? So one of the brothers, Hamid, he married a girl named Habiban, right? And what happened is that people thought this Habiban, aka Habib, was a boy. They didn't, until actually there happened to be pictures of both individuals, and obviously they looked very different. So that was how we were able to confirm them. In some cases, you may not be so fortunate to have pictures of both individuals. So again, it can be confusing, in those instances. In some cases, as you can see in the examples that are given, not all the siblings had the same last name, or not all their last names had the same spelling, right? It all depends on how the names are registered, right? Some girls had Nisha, Nesha, or Nisa as their last name, and they didn't have the last name of the father. Some girls had Bibi at the front of their name or Maimun, and some boys had Muhammad. In some cases, one of the sons married a second wife after the first wife passed, or had more than one wife at once, right? In some cases, siblings named their child after one of their nieces or nephews that passed young. And I actually encountered this maybe once or twice, but it's not that common. But you may come across that. When inserting information, go with how the name is pronounced until it is confirmed by documents or how it is spelled based on how the person giving you info spells it. In some cases, couples adopted children. In some cases, couples had children in somewhat of a considerable gap, meaning like they had a child in 1910, and then in 1918, for example, they had another child, and there's no children in between. In some cases, they had children a year after year. Like in one instance, they had children for like 10 straight years, one after the other. Those are just different examples that I've experienced, right? Also, something that tends to cause problems is when there is a child that was born out of wedlock, right? When you had a child, when people that was more common than you would think, right? In those days, and a lot of times you find that the family actually refuse to accept the person or even acknowledge the person's existence, and that is completely wrong. Because regardless of how the child came into the world, the child is still part of the family, regardless of what you may think. No matter how they came into the world, they're still your family. In a lot of cases, I've actually encountered that. It's very sad. It's pathetic how people think. Like, yes, having a child out of wedlock is wrong, but if a child, the child has nothing to do with what the parents did. The child is innocent. You can't just shun the child because of what the parents did. It's wrong. It's ridiculous. Using social media to find family, part one. Facebook can be used for connecting with older family members because most older people do not have things like Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter. You could perhaps find more family through mutual friends, like through the same last name, etc. And you'll encounter some people that actually like post a lot about their life. So sometimes you could even get ancestry pictures. And that's happened to me maybe twice. Like I'm talking like your ancestors, because some people they happen to post because they're like the over posters. So you can actually, if you scroll through, you'll find it. I've personally met a lot of family. I learned way more than just trying to learn more info than through the family I already knew. And of course, a big plus with Facebook is that you can create family groups, you know, and you can use these to connect with more and more family, right? And of course, member quantity is not a must, but I would say the more the better. Keep in mind that with groups, some may not want their date of birth in the family tree or pick shared, and you have to respect that. Yeah, again, it's good you try to keep in contact with the family you find, particularly the people, those who are very kind, and you try to stay far from the negative people, because you will encounter that. There's a lot of very unkind people, and that's putting it nicely. Like, um, later on in your journey, you can use Instagram for connecting with younger family members, but this is way down the road, because with Instagram, most people don't use their last names. So it's challenging to find family through Instagram. Most of the time, you would find it through mutual followers, but just happening to find family through Instagram is very difficult. So that's way down the line. Again, like I said, a big plus with Facebook is groups, and like I said, you can create a family group, or you can even join different groups focused on a particular village, a particular part of Guyana. So, like for example, at one time, I was trying to find descendants or relatives that I had from two friends. So I wrote something brief, like what is on the left there, in the group listed in one of the groups listed on the right. I wrote that post. I posted it in the bottom group there, Beehive, Clonbrook, Greenfield, and Anne's Grove Connection. And I also put it in the Guyana Story Pictures Old and New. Like again, the bottom group there is there. The villages are very close to each other. Two Friends is very close. Is like the neighboring village to all of those. So it was relevant, and I was able to connect with relatives there. A lot actually than what I was hoping to accomplish. I mean, which is what I was trying to accomplish in the first place, anyways, right? And of course, there are way more other groups that I didn't have space to list here. But these are just a few examples. I mean, social media in the whole is very useful. It just depends on how you use it. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. But for me, I used it to find family, and I was successful for the most part. So if I was successful with it, then who's to say you won't be successful with it? You know what I'm saying? Ancestral websites and DNA. A few websites that I'm kind of familiar with is Geni, um, Ancestry.com, and of course MyHeritage. All of which I believe require a paid subscription. None of which are cheap, by the way. I mean, I never paid for any of these, like to use them, because people just gave me their account information. That's how I was able to access them, like my extended relatives, and they were kind enough to do that for me. And that's how I was able to access them. With Ancestry.com, you can still search the database, and you can still find information. You just can't like see the actual physical document without paying the monthly fee or whatever. but you can still get the information. So that's the most important part, obviously. So, doing the DNA test, right? You could pay about $120 plus shipping and handling for a DNA test. And of course, again, there are other websites that offer the same thing. I was told, I read somewhere online that 23andMe can be used. It's better for Caribbean people to use, actually, which is interesting. So you can try that, I guess. You can try Ancestry. It's up to you. It's still a good set of money regardless which website you use. Gemini is good in a sense because it lets you use it lets you connect with individuals that are connected in more than one way. And with Guyanese people, that's very common. Like, oh, you're related to this way. Oh, but you're actually related to them on the other side of the family as well. And that's happened to me more than once. And again, with the DNA test, it really depends on your level of determination to find your roots. Most likely, you won't connect with actual relatives, but in some cases, you may if you have a lot of information put into your family tree, which you should do. You should have done before doing the DNA test. Create a basic family tree and put in as far as you can, your parents, grandparents, great grandparents, etc., as far as you can possibly go before doing the test. So maybe you can connect with one of your second cousins, your third cousins, etc. And who knows, you can connect with one of them, and maybe they had went further in their research, which means you would be able to go further in your research. So you can coincide, and and you can message the people that you've matched with. Basically, what you will receive from your results is DNA matches, which is a list of individuals who have also taken the test whose DNA somewhat matches with yours, and you can perhaps find a connection to them if the two of you have a mutual ancestor, like your grandparent, your great grandparent, etc. Right? DNA story. This shows you where in the world your DNA connects where your DNA traces back to. And then, of course, through lines, which means this lets you view how you relate the DNA matches. So in this slide, right, as you can see on the left side, you can see like this is the test I had done for my mother, and this is her matches. So of course I scratched out the names for privacy reasons, but this shows you like the possible relation to them, like if that it could be your first cousin, etc. Right? And of course, this is on the right. This is a test I had done for my grandmother. And again, it shows you the percentages of where your DNA takes you back to. Some people, like one guy I was talking to, he just wanted to find out where his ancestors came from. He didn't want to know who his ancestors were. He just wanted to find out where they came from. So this can be useful for him, for example. For people like him. In terms of Ancestry.com, and for most of those ancestry websites, it does not provide much beneficial information for Guyanese people in particular. I cannot speak for other Caribbean people. I assume it's probably the same thing. According to ancestry websites and Guyanese people, one person actually told me that they would never do this test because they don't want to give their DNA to those people. So again, it's up to you. Some people are very private with their life, and that's okay. And the only family record you can really get is if, for example, you have family that moved to America, Canada, or England. For example, if your parents or your grandparents immigrated to America and they rented or owned a place, there's a good chance their names, date of birth, and address should be there. Not their full address, obviously, but their address, like their city and whatever that they lived in. For example, your grandmother came to America and she passed in America, right? Her info can be found. This info should be available in Canada as well as England, and it can help to an extent. At best, they would provide their parents' name, but nothing about the parents, like where they came from and etc. About your grandmother, like for example, like in a lot of cases, some people don't know anything about their grandparents, because they passed a while ago, and then their parents don't really know anything, right? Like for example, this individual that I created, like for example, on the right there, you see the info that I have for her, right? So let's say this is my grandmother, and she obviously is a female, I don't know her date of birth, but she came from Guyana and she died in 2005. You can perhaps find, if you know where she died, you can the database might be able to provide it. If you haven't, like in this example, I didn't put in a date of birth, a year of birth, but if you happen to know a year of birth, the more info you know, the better, right? But for example, you can get the date of birth, you can get the place of birth, and you can get the death date. You can get the names of the parents. But yeah, this is pretty much the primary way you can gain info about your grandparents through ancestry.com is if they came here. And if your grandparents had older siblings, right, that you were sure that, okay, they had the same parents, right? Your grandparents and their siblings I've talked about, right? That they had the same parents. Let's say they had an older sibling that also came to America or Canada or England, for example, and they died over there. Use their info. Like, let's say I had, like, one of my great grandfathers. He had two brothers that came over here that were also born before 1930. Let's say I didn't know that great grandfather's date of birth. I could have used the brothers' info because I knew I had the names of his siblings, and two of his siblings came to America. So that's just another way, and that's if they share the same parents, because in some cases they didn't. In some cases they had a different mother, or in some cases they maybe even had a different father. Who knows? It changes, depends on your family, you know. And again, if they were born before 1930, then you can use this info to trace them to the archives, which I'll talk about later on. So this chart is like called the cousin chart. This is pretty useful for like beginners who don't really understand what is a second cousin, what is a third cousin, what is a fourth cousin, etc. What is a third cousin first removed? And of course, this chart, you can find it on Google. It's pretty useful. And whenever some of my cousins have trouble understanding what is a third cousin, I just send in this and boom, it comes 100% clear for them. So it's something that you can use as a guide, like, until you can become more familiar with the terminology. So this book, The Who is Who in British Guiana, 1945 to 1948. Roughly about 4,351 individuals are mentioned in this book, majority of which are British and to a small amount Indians, Afro-Guyanese, and the Chinese Guyanese, right? About 378 are women, and of course the rest are men. So there's a very small percentage of women that are mentioned in the book. So it's basically like I don't know how to explain it. It's like a glossary, like a phone, like an address book, kind of like, like something like that, like it's basically something like that, right? So it's worth checking out. It costs about $40 US dollars in US dollars, and it can be found on Amazon. You don't have to keep it, but I would suggest if you can afford it, you can keep it, because as you progress in your journey and continue to learn more, it may come in handy. So the two primary benefits of this book, as you can see on the left, founder of Makdoum Village, Kramat Ali Makdoum, it lists his occupation, where he currently lived at the time, his date of birth, and some details about him, positions he's held, etc. In most cases, this is what you'd find for the individuals. Again, take it as a hint until you can confirm, hopefully by the documents you hopefully find at the archives or the GRO. So these are the most common Indian surnames that I've come across. For some of the people, there happened to be pictures for these people, so that would be kind of cool. Like, let's say your great grandfather or somebody is mentioned in this book. There's a chance their picture might be there too. So if you don't have a picture of them, this can be a way to get a picture of them. Like, for example, my brother-in-law, his great grandfather is mentioned in this book, and I was able to get a young days picture of his great grandfather for him. So, I mean, I personally wasn't able to get any ancestral photographs because none of my ancestors are in this book, but a couple of their siblings are mentioned in the book. So, but I was able to get information that kind of helped me to a point, and it's worth checking out you could contact me. You could just send in your last name and ask me if the last name is mentioned in the book, and I'll look it up for you. Just because these names are here doesn't mean those are the only Indian surnames in the book. There are other surnames that are not as common as the names that I mentioned here. The General Register Office, the GRO. There's some basic details listed about them. They're actually very difficult to get in contact with. It's ridiculous. That I was told that the records of the GRO is in poor condition, but that's not really a surprise to me because the records of the archives are also in poor condition. So that's not really anything surprising. However, I was actually able to get a response from them through texting them on Facebook Messenger and through the WhatsApp number that I provided there. So you can try doing those two methods. Surprisingly, email didn't work with them, but I reached out to other people. I talked to other people about the GRO, and some people have been waiting for months for them to, and it's ridiculous. They haven't. GROs, if you can avoid having to go to the GRO, then try not to. If you can hopefully get information that can help you at the archives, then try to do that, man. Because try to avoid dealing with the GRO because it's ridiculous. The whole situation with the GRO, they're extremely slow. They're not very helpful. I just can't understand how they operate like that. Let's say that, for example, you didn't know any information about your grandparents. You could potentially use your parents' information and hopefully maybe get their birth certificate, and maybe through them you can get your grandparents' birth certificate. So requesting info, again, if you can avoid this, try to do so. But if you have to, there's two ways you can receive the info. Basically what you can provide to them, right, is, let's say, your name, the name, hopefully the correct name, if you have it, the correct name, the date of birth, the place of birth, and hopefully that'll be enough. If you know the parent's name, that's even better. They can't provide this information directly because it is personal information. That's what the person on the WhatsApp number told me. So that's what I'm telling you guys. But there are two ways you can receive the information, right? You can go in physically, or you can ask someone to do this for you. That's what I did. I asked one of my third cousins to go in physically. But even then, they gave her the push around. So it's, like I said, it's ridiculous. A ridiculous situation at the GRO. You can also contact the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or your local Guyana consulate. So what do you, the person, have to do? Again, you can, through their WhatsApp or their Facebook or the Facebook Messenger, you can text them name, date of birth, place of birth, and parent's name if possible. If they're successful in finding your requested information, then you have to fill out the application that contains the information you sent to them, and perhaps you could ask someone to take this application to the GRO in person. If someone's doing it for you, then the person has to say that they are that they are there on behalf of you, and would have to provide your number and actually the date that you were in contact with the GRO. It costs about 300 Guyana dollars per application that you give into them, about $1.45 US. Contacting the Ministry or Consulate, simply state where you were located and state that you're requesting copies of your ancestors' birth records from the General Register Office in Guyana. So you can Google New York Guyana Consulate or Florida Guyana Consulate, etc. You Google it and you find your local consulate and you get the number and you call them. But again, that's like a last resort. If you can get somebody to go in physically, or you can go in physically yourself and do that. Contacting the ministry or the consulate, it should be like a last resort. So this is a birth certificate application form. You have to fill out the date of birth. What you can do is you can even use your fingers, or if you have like an Apple Pencil or something, or you could, if you're old school, you could print it out, write on it, and fill in what you know, and then scan it and send it to the person that's gonna take it for you, or if you're gonna take it yourself, whichever way you choose. It's the marriage certificate. What you can do is you can maybe put in like the place they got married, the names of the people, and you can maybe find the marriage certificate, and I'll explain later why the marriage certificate can be useful for you. Same with the death certificate. Again, you can find these on Google. I could even send it to you if you happen to, for some reason, not find it. So this is some general information about the Walter Rodney Archives in Guyana. It has 3 numbers. You download the app Boss Revolution. You can put in $20 or something. Because, they don't have a WhatsApp number. So you have to call them to the regular phone number that they have. That's why I said you can download Boss Revolution, put in $20 or something, and call them through that. There was an upstairs number and a downstairs number. I can't remember which is which, but you can try calling the first one and work your way down to the other 2 numbers. They are closed on all the holidays that the Republic of Guyana observes, so you can Google and try to find out through there. So this is the Walter Rodney Archives brochure. These are some banners that are on display at the archives. Again, you can pause the video anytime and to read this. So this is the list of holdings that I was able to find on the internet, and this can be useful because it would help give you an idea of whether or not the person whose lineage you're trying to learn more about is in the archives. And there are actually a lot of missing records, like gaps of records that are not in existence at the archives. So, like for example, there is a set of records that are missing between 1880 and I think 1887. 1886. For Demerara, like for example, me, right? I have 3 ancestors that were born between that period, so I wasn't able to get any parental information really about them. So I had to go through their siblings. For one of them, I didn't know his parents' name, I didn't know his siblings, so his lineage just stops there. I can't do anything else there. And then for one of them, for the other 2 actually, their fathers had other wives. Like for one of them, the father had like 14 or something. I don't even know how that even makes sense, but he had like 14 wives is what the stories say, right? So, and it's been proven so far, there's been at least 4 wives that the information was found for. So like her mother, I'm not even sure if her mother is the person that I was told to be her mother. And it would only be confirmed by her birth record, which is not there. And then for another, her father had the ancestor. Her father had 2 wives, and I think I was told she was the eldest sibling, but again, I don't know who was her mother for sure, because she had another sister that was born 2 years later to the same mother, to a mother that I believe to be her mother as well. But then a year after, there was another child that was born to another mother. Again, that's why this kind of helps you get an idea of what records that are there and what is not there, and if you need to find other pieces of information to go around those missing records. Like for example, in the video that I referenced earlier by Talisha Ramsaru, she mentioned that there's a set of records that are missing between 1920 and 1922, and those records are completely destroyed. It's very unfortunate, but again, that's why it's so important to find out info about the siblings, because you can once you know that okay, those siblings had the same parents, the same 2 parents, then you can use the siblings info to get to who you're looking for. When you call the archives now, tell them what you intend on doing, which is obviously tracing your ancestors. They will tell you to email the information, and basically what you do is give them a week. If they don't get back to you, call them and tell them that you're following up and that you called, for example, like a week ago or 2 weeks ago. So basically what you will need, for someone born before 1930 in Demerara, in Esquibos 1928, in Barbies, it's 1924. Okay, so you need the full name, the date of birth, the village of birth, and again, if you know the parent's name or if you know the siblings, it can help narrow it down. So essentially, you just keep tracing backwards until you reach the names of the immigrants from India. You can look for potential siblings of this person. If that specific person is not found, look for a person with the same parents, basically. The dates are vital to decipher the exact identity, since in many instances, there are thousands of arrivals recorded with the same name. As you go through different documents in the archive, names tend to be spelled differently, as you basically have to correspond. For example, in some cases it's spelled with an A, and in other cases it's spelled with an E. Again, going back to the missing records, one of my ancestors, he was said to have died in 1945, but that period of records is not at the archive. Tracing your lineage at the National Archives Part 2. If you plan on going in person, plan it out, set aside a few days because the process does take time, depending on how much ancestors you plan to look for. It's better to go in the morning. Take a notebook to contain the names, birth dates, birth villages before you go. Expect to spend a few hours because if there's a lot of info to be found, you may have to go again another day. If you're unable to go in person, you could try calling them or emailing them. Make sure to ask the person for their name if they have been helpful. I would recommend calling them first and tell them you'd like to trace an individual depending on who you get in contact with. The person may ask for the individual information, and then you give that person your contact info, or the person will simply tell you to email the information. But as you call them over time, like if a person doesn't help you immediately, you'll kind of be able to differentiate between who is helpful and who is not. How easy was the archives to access? You do not need a letter of introduction, visa, permission, or particular identification. You can literally just walk in. They may ask you to write your name into a register when requesting material. How easy was the archival material to use? The archive allowed photography, and a photocopying service is available for a fee. Many documents were fragile and in some sort of state of decay. All that the archivists were able to do were offer book supports. The rest is up to the researcher to be gentle and be careful with the material. As to the number of documents you could view at a time, this very much depended on the archivist. Some required that you only ask for only 2 items at a time, while others did not. You could browse through the various collections of newspapers at the archives, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. What sort of catalogs or finding aids does the archive have? Part 1. There is no online catalog available, which is very unfortunate, but there are a few finding aids available at the archives, which include 2 large binders that act as a record of the holdings. The cataloging was done in 1994 and has only been periodically updated with minor pencil annotations stating whether an item is now lost or too fragile to handle. They are on a whole accurate. A printout of an Excel sheet that gives you more detail about the British Guiana colonial government's immigration department. A binder of the newspapers held at the archives, a binder of the documents that were transferred from the register office to the archives, which include land grants, contracts, wills from the 18th to 19th century. Note that these have access restrictions, so which means that you probably have to provide proof beforehand that you're related to the people. The archive material and catalog was in English, so that was not a problem. It's not like it'll be in Hindi or something, it'll be in English. What sort of catalogs or finding aids does the archive have? Part 2. The archives currently houses approximately 22 ledgers of ship registers documenting the arrivals of Indians in British Guiana during varying periods of indentureship. Assistant archivist John L. Henry explained that each of the books contained records from as many as 22 ships, each of which would have transported about 600 passengers on each voyage. According to Henry, there are also immigration passes, land ownership documents such as transports, records of birth, death, and baptism, as well as correspondence bearing information of some immigrants on the sugar plantations. So the difference between a British Guiana birth certificate and a more recent Guyana birth certificate. So as you can see on the left is a typical old school British Guiana birth certificate, and this lists their birth certificate number, when and where born, their name, gender, name and surname of father, and other description, name and surname of mother, and other description, father's rank or profession, signature, qualification, and residence of informer, when it was registered, signature of registrar, baptismal names, if added, after registration of birth and date. As you can see under the parent's name, In some cases, you may encounter that there's a BR number, which means that there is a birth register number. In some birth certificates that you come across, it would have the birth record number, and like for example, Sharifan Ali, it would have, like in some cases it would have the BR number. This is, let's say, 440 of 1907, and more. It would have those three pieces of information. So let's say that was the birth certificate of a child of an immigrant. Under the parent's name, it would have the name of the name of the parent, the year they arrived, the ship, and their immigrant number. So, but unfortunately, on the right now, which is a more modern birth certificate, this wouldn't have that type of information, right? Which is very unfortunate, but you have to ultimately try to get siblings' names of the people, try to go further back, There's multiple methods, like I said. So when the people, again, something to keep in mind here, right, is when the people at the office register the name, the last name is added in based on what you put as the father's surname. They didn't write the surname on the paper because it was automatically added in. The surname would appear twice if you register your child's complete name with the last name and then father's name. And in some cases, the first name and last name are mixed up or names are spelled wrong. Unfortunately, in some cases, many children do not use their father's surname, especially when they name their own children. Henceforth, the last name is not passed on and therefore lost. So this is what a typical birth register states. On the left, you can see the BR number, the name, the race, the date of birth, the name of the father, the immigrant number if the father came from India, or it would have their BR number and the year of their birth, the name of the ship if it applies, again if they came from India, the year of arrival, the name of mother, and the immigrant number if she came from India, or the BR number and the year, and the ship, of course, if she came from India, and their place of birth and remarks, right? And in some cases, you may see death details if they died in Guyana, right? Like for example, one of my great-grandfathers, he died in England, so his death record I was able to find not in the Guyana archives, but in the British information from ancestry.com. Find from the archives if they died in Guyana, or ancestry.com if they died in America, Canada, or England. There's other methods, So the immigrant number, right, is the number next to the parent's name that can be used to locate their immigration pass. The year of arrival, ship name. But again, essentially, you just keep tracing backward until you reach the child that is of the immigrants. Basically, you just keep tracing backwards until you reach that stage. So in some cases, the parents, like for example, if the parents didn't come from India and they were born in Guyana as well, and their names are sometimes spelled differently, what I would suggest is you take the spelling that is on their individual birth register. So this is a typical British Guiana marriage certificate. There are two different types of marriage certificates. On the top, there are the two names of the people getting married, their country, if these are both people that were born in Guyana, their BR number and the year they were born, and the place they are living, and the date of their marriage. On the bottom left that's a marriage certificate for immigrants. So again, it would have the two individual names, their immigrant number, the name of their ship, the year of arrival, and the estate or plantation they were bound to. Understanding what an immigration certificate states. Immigration certificates began being issued starting around mid-1865. Before, the records of the immigrants that came were simply listed in registers. It was first called immigration certificates, and then later it was called a pass. Earlier documents, like for example the registers, did not the village of origin, but later the passes or the certificates did state that. There were three main parts the immigrants were shipped from: Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. So when you hear the story of an immigrant ancestor and how they came from Calcutta, like my grandfather told my cousin how his ancestors came from Calcutta, that's not necessarily true. It could mean that they left from the port of Calcutta, but that doesn't necessarily mean they came from Calcutta, you know? So you have to do a little bit of digging to find that exact area they came from. So essentially, right, it would list their, and these are in later documents, right? It would state their registration details such as the place, date, and register number. It would list their depot number, their coulee number, which is typically written on the pass. It's typically written on the document, the ship name, the date arrived, the name, the father's name, the age, the caste, the height, if it's a man or woman, but if it's a child, most likely the height isn't mentioned. The name of the next of kin, if married to whom, again, if applicable. Their zilla, which is the administrative district, the thana, which is the police station, and the pergula or taluk, the subdivision of a district, the village, the bodily marks, if there is any, the occupation in India. But sometimes the occupation in India isn't mentioned. And again, if the immigrant number in the estate or plantation they were sent to is typically written on this paper. The immigrant number is written on the top left there, as you can see, and the estate or plantation is written on the side. There are essentially 4 different types of immigration passes: man, woman, boy, or girl. Back in those days, an infant was considered a child from infancy to about 5 years old. As you can see, there's a spot there for a fingerprint, but it's not common. So if you happen to get an ancestor's immigration pass with a fingerprint on it, you're fortunate, because none of my ancestors, for example, had a fingerprint on the pass. It's not very common to see. Regarding immigrant numbers, based on my own family research, it appears that 2 and 3 digit numbers, like the immigrant number, was issued to earlier immigrants up until maybe the 1880s. Then 5 number digits were given, and maybe even 6-digit numbers. In some cases, you might see ROFD written next to the name. And basically what this means is that they are a returnee of Demerara. And basically that means that they were in Guyana before, and after completion of their contract, they went back and then returned for maybe a second or third time. Immigration certificates would typically be duplicated at the archives in India. This is a typical immigrant register. On the top there, you can see the name of the port they came from, the ship they came on, and the date of arrival. And then on the left there, the immigrant number, the name, the gender, age, father's name, caste, height, bodily marks, the name of plantation or estate they were sent to, the number if in the marriage register, if applicable, the date of certificate of exemption, the number in obituary register if applicable, and the year of repatriation, if I'm saying that right, if applicable. And that's if they returned. And remarks, like the estate records, the plantation records are not at the archives. Who knows? I have no idea where those records would be though. So an exemption from labor certificate. Sometimes this may be amongst your family. So you can ask, you can find out, and maybe somebody in the family has that document. And this actually makes it a lot easier because this has their immigrant number, the ship name, and year of arrival, which can be used to find their immigrant pass. So this basically states the gender, the name or plantation that they were sent to at the top there, the name of the immigrant, the father's name, the age on arrival, the height, immigrant number, ship name, and the year of arrival, the date of indenture, bodily marks, the number of certificate, the number of certificate, and the date it was issued. So this is like a casual certificate. In some cases, it was issued to those who came at their own expense, and it was possibly even listed in a register. And it lists the name, father's name, the gender, gender and age on registration, the date of arrival in the colony, from where they arrived from, number and year of registration, their bodily marks, number and date when certificate was issued. So this is a typical death register of immigrants, right? And basically what this listed is their death number, their name of the name of the immigrant, their gender, their age at their death, their immigrant number, name of ship, year of arrival. If you happen to know where they died and what year they died, then you can even ask them to go in this to look for it. And who knows, you can find their immigration details from their death register, and you can go backwards from there. It lists their date of death, their cause of death, and their place of death. So in the case of the immigrant's death that you're looking for cannot be found at the archives, again, you can try contacting the GRO, and what you will need to provide to them is the name of the individual, the immigrant number, then the estate they were sent to, and the death number. And this can be typically found on immigrant register. In the case you don't know the death number, you may be able to find their death information through their name, immigrant number, name of ship, and year of arrival. So this is a typical death certificate, and this states their number, their when and where they died, name, surname, and other description, gender, age, rank of profession, and other description, cause of death, signature, qualification, and residence of informant when registered, and the signature of the registrar. An immigrant will can be used to find the immigrant details that you need to go back to the immigration details, like the register or the immigrant pass. And this lists their name, immigrant number, name of ship, and year of arrival. So essentially, right, the records found at the Guyana archives. It has 358 shiploads. Immigrant certificates range from 1865 to 1917. Immigration Department letter books, register of births, annual reports of Immigration Agent General, report of the Committee on Immigration from India to the Crown Colonies and Protectorates, statistical return immigration from India, Immigration Department correspondence. Archival sources on Indian immigration legal matters from 1860 to 1917. Minutes of the Court of Policy, minutes of the Combined Court, minutes of the Combined Court, Secretary of State letters, Governor's dispatches, rules, regulation, and bylaws, orders in council, blue books, petitions, minutes judge apart, minutes of the Supreme Court, minutes of the Supreme Court Appellate, minutes of the Supreme Court Civil Justice, criminal trials, Chief Justice notes, and official gazettes. Records that may be referenced indirectly is transports, mortgages, and debts. Again, going back to the death record, you can use the death record to potentially find the immigration details that you need on the person you're looking for. There are copies of over 30 different newspapers published during the earlier years. All of these records contain information on Guyanese ancestry and are used by the public to trace their roots. So one of the benefits of looking through newspaper is that you can find things like marriage announcements, death announcements, etc. Some of the newspapers that are listed here, some of the newspapers that you can look through include the Royal Gazette, the Official Gazette, the Guyana Chronicle, the Colonist, the Creole, the Times, Amar Joyti, Indian Opinion, the Quill, the Truth, the Voice of Islam, and Gandhi News. As you can see in these pictures, this is how a lot of the records unfortunately look. It's very, very sad that the records are in such a state. So I would strongly advise you that if you have the funds and the time, please try to get started on your ancestry project, because each day they haven't completed the digitation project is another day that the records continue to deteriorate. So this is an online resource that you can use to find details about like the ship records, but not necessarily names of the immigrants, but you can find like other details, like how many other people came on that voyage, and etc. You could gain access to it by being part of a post-secondary institution, or you could try to get a 30-day trial, just try and mess around with it, and it's kind of interesting, to be honest. Conducting research at the National Archives in the UK. Some people have said that all the records are digitized, but I really don't know. I listed some links that could be useful. I mean, I was told that it's digitized. You could try contacting them. You could try going in person, or you could ask somebody that you know that lives there to do this for you. It's really up to you. I'm really not familiar with the process of finding info here, so I can't be of much help. Just like here, I've obviously never went through this process, but from the videos that I've seen, this is some of the info that I was able to get. There's some of the tips, what you will need beforehand, immigration documents for your Indian ancestor, birth certificate starting from you all the way to the child of the Indian ancestor you wish to find out about. It has to be, it has to link directly back to you because, then if you don't, then you may need written permission from the government of the country that you're living in and the Indian government simply because you do not have proof that you are laid genuine in India. The documents must be stamped and signed up to date, and you can then use these documents to apply for your OCI visa. Again, these are some links that could be useful. It's worth checking out. Maybe it can be of use to you. If you have the chance to travel to India, there's a chance you could connect with families still living there. I know of someone actually that went to India and brought one of the family members they found over to the States. Again, like I said earlier, in the case you know the name of the Indian immigrant, try to find out details that would separate them from those who may have had the same name. Did they come as a child, an adult, or were they born on the ship? The accompanying relatives, if there was any, did any of them return to India because memories would be more alive if they returned? The caste, try to find their exemption from labor certificate. If you can find this, or if a relative happens to have this, you can find the ancestry almost right away. The location in India they were from, you try to find out the birth year of the eldest child of that person born in Guyana. Other ways of matching information would be through the person's caste and village. Death certificate is important because it mentions where that person was born, Guyana or India. Building an arrival scenario. You gather these types of details such as your immigration certificate or pass, the returnees, the families, the remittances, the period newspapers or obituaries, the publications, like for example, the Who's Who in British Guiana could be a resource that could be helpful. Conducting research in India, part 2. Try to go to the district archives in the records room and look for documents such as land documents, death registers, voter lists similar to a census, contains father's name, can go forward or backward with this, electoral rolls, and the family register. There are places that would have local documents, like for example land documents or the Katoni, and when you do that you can trace to more recent times. Voter lists were created in India in 1852 during the first elections. Families were kept in blocks, so it's something like a census. If you could get the electoral rolls for your village, then you could see if your ancestor is mentioned as a father or a brother in the father's name column. There are also the family register that are contained in the villages in India. They maintain only Hindu records, but Muslim records can be found in Mumbai or the Aligarh University. Armed with the knowledge that you have, get immigration certificates, and so when you visit the villages, there is a composite of occupations and castes. Try to locate the people of your caste in India, especially the elders, and ask them questions like your father's name, your grandfather's name, and so on, hoping that one of the names they call out is one of the names on the paper you have. Challenges with tracing family in India. Most people who left did not have any agricultural land, or any land for that matter, under their name. In some cases, the village written on the immigration pass is incorrect, and now some villages are divided into multiple villages. Geographical locations have changed over the years. Current generations do not typically have any knowledge of indentureship or their ancestors' names. In some cases, the village of the immigrant listed is the popular village in the nearby area of where the person was actually living. In some cases, the person they listed as next of kin was the popular person in the village, and not their actual relative. In some villages, there's something called recruiter phobia. They thought things like, why are these strangers here? Perhaps they're here to take away our young people, as recruiters have done in the past. Why are these distant relatives coming to meet us? Maybe they're coming to take away our property. There's a new fear as well. Muslims are becoming wary of certain laws that have been passed in India. Some are very scared to give out information. Some are very scared to work with strangers. Some lower caste people were scared of some higher caste people because they were trying to take away their land and so on. And there are some who felt that their ancestors left. They only went to Calcutta. They thought that they didn't go halfway around the world. So if you have to try to calm the village, what you can do is perhaps call the local pundit, imam, or mukia, that is the head of the village, to work with you. You have to be honest and clear about your objectives, and most villages will accept you. When the people were leaving, they were given a form to fill in, which is called an Agreement for Indentured Immigrants form. And this listed, some of the things they listed was the date, name of immigrant, the father's name, village or town, and mahalla, the district, the thana, the gender, the age, the occupation, and what they will do with the property they have in India. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of forms like this in existence. So when you have the time, look over the series of videos titled How to Find Your Ancestral Family in India, presented by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. And again, a lot of these info has, especially with tracing your family in India, has obviously been sourced from these videos. Because I obviously have not been to India. I've used the info from these videos and I put it into this presentation. But again, you can always go back to these videos, check them out for yourself. Maybe you'll learn something that I failed to mention in this video. Most of these are available on Facebook. Part 1 of the ancestry videos is on YouTube. These are some recommended books, videos, and films on indentureship that I thought were really nice, and it's definitely worth checking out, purchasing, videoing. The YouTube videos. Again, Who is Minani? That video was done by Talisha Ramsarup. You can check that out for yourself. Maybe I missed something that you can perhaps learn in that video. Some other videos that you can learn about indentureship, the coolies, how Britain reinvented slavery, and those other videos. They're very useful, very beneficial, very educational. And again, you can check them out for yourself. In terms of the films, Guyana 1838 The Arrival and did have a lot of flaws, especially Guyana 1838 The Arrival. There were some factual errors that the writers made a mistake with, or they just chose not to mention, meaning that the Muslims, for example, there were Muslim immigrants in the arrival that first came, but the writer didn't mention that, for example. Who knows what other things he didn't mention? But that's just one example, right? These are some online resources that could perhaps help you with tracing your roots. For those of African Guyanese heritage, information on Africans in Guyana can be found in property lists of mortgage plantations, transports of lands purchased by free slaves, Who's Who publications. Again, Who's Who in British Guiana can be useful here, census data and church records, but that may not be in existence. For those who have ancestors of indigenous heritage, church records may be a good place to start in the absence of any birth records. Also family Bibles and primarily oral history. For those of Chinese Guyanese heritage, there are 2 books with registers of Chinese arrivals. Perhaps try the archives in China as well. There's a chance records can be there. For those of Portuguese Guyanese heritage, there is 1 book with registers of Portuguese. You could try looking into the Portuguese archive as well. For those of Dutch Guyanese heritage and can read Dutch, preferably Old Dutch, the archives in the Netherlands gathered all the documents they have on Guyana some years ago and digitized them. These are some suggested locations you can go to or contact to conduct research on Guyana's history. And on the right there are other newspapers that you can look into to learn about indentureship, or you can find stories of Guyanese individuals that they mentioned on the page. Oh, and if you have the time, you could try visiting various cemeteries. throughout the country, and if you find a relative's grave, you may be able to find the date of birth or date of death information. Like for example, one of my great-great-grandmothers, her brother was buried behind a rice mill in Mahica Creek, behind a former rice mill in Mahica Creek, and the date of death was right there. So for example, right, you can probably take to the archives that date, and you could find the cause of death. So that would be nice if you're trying to write a book about your ancestors. That would be a nice, addition. So this is a brief background of my personal ancestral journey. I began around February 2012 at the age of 11. Maybe about 4 or 5 things inspired me to learn more about my family. The first of which was my cousin sending around a picture of our great-great-grandfather that I had never seen before, and it was dated 1893. It was like really amazing for me to see such an old photograph of my ancestors. Of course, the book Holy Woman, I read that maybe around the age of 16, 17, and from then on, I was like, wow, this is so cool. I didn't know that it was going to be done and whatnot, and then, of course, growing up, as a Muslim, a lot of people had in their houses this chart that stated the genealogy of the prophets. So from that, I was like, man, what if I can do that with my ancestors? And then on the top right there, you can see a family tree chart, and that was from the show Time Warp Trio. It's basically a book that the main character Joe had. That particular part of the show that also sparked my interest. And of course, watching the show Finding Your Roots on PBS, that was really interesting for me as well. The whole process, the way they just laid it out for the people and how amazed they were. I was like, why can't I do that? And of course, all the roadblocks that I mentioned as tips to you guys, those are all things. I mean, it's a lot more challenging to trace your lineage as a Guyanese because a lot of the records are not. None of the records are digitized, which is very unfortunate, but it is what it is. Regarding Facebook, I created about 6 family groups or more, and to date, I've connected with hundreds of family members. Hundreds. Like I said, it's hard to stay connected to all of them, but you try to stay connected to those who stay connected to you. It's a two-way street. Special thanks to all of these individuals that I mentioned here. They've all provided very, very useful information, and you could Google them online and maybe find them, their individual work that they have done, especially Shamsuddin, Ashwini Rajpal, Moritz Hassan Khan, like the information that they put out there, I just compiled into this one presentation. So now we've come to the conclusion. Thank you so much for looking at this video. Tracing your genealogy is not easy, but it is a lot more doable than accessible than you may think. You can learn a lot of life lessons. I can tell you many life lessons I've learned. It helps you towards developing an emotional attachment toward your ancestors. Learning about your ancestors and documenting their stories is one way to honor them. Connecting with family can be a very joyful feeling, so don't delay. Start trying to learn more about your ancestors as soon as you can. If you would like a last name to be looked for in the Who is Who book, like I said earlier, feel free to email me or DM me on Instagram or Facebook, Journey Through the Generations at gmail.com. So before we close off, I'd like to share something with you guys. I saw this on the internet a few months ago, I think, and I thought this was really cool. In order to be born, you needed 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 second great-grandparents, 32 third great-grandparents, 64 fourth great-grandparents, 128 fifth great-grandparents, 256 sixth great-grandparents, 512 seventh great-grandparents, 1024 eighth great-grandparents, and 2048 ninth great-grandparents. So for you to be born today from 12 previous generations, you needed a total of 4,094 ancestors over the last 400 years. Think for a moment how many struggles, how many battles, how many difficulties, how much sadness, how much happiness, how many love stories, how many expressions of hope for the future, did your ancestors have to undergo for you to exist in this present moment? But again, thank you so much. I know the audio isn't perfect, but it is what it is, right? So take care. Until next time.